All right, welcome to the September 13th, Wednesday, Istio Combined Work Group meeting. So first up on the agenda, we have the 120 release logistics. Eric, can you tell us what took place in the TOC discussion?
Yeah, so we talked about this at the TOC, and as I took notes, I think this is my notes. We decided that it made sense to have a release candidate that was ready for use by those that were going to be at Istio Day and KubeCon. So it sort of made sense to have it built, say, the week before KubeCon. So we talked about having it the Wednesday before, I think, which is November 1st. And then we could push a final release after KubeCon. There was some discussion. It seemed that we were potentially cutting the 1.20 development time fairly short if we tried to do everything before KubeCon to get the, the 1.20.0 release out before KubeCon, being that we spent a little extra time in the 1.19 calendar. So if that would work with you, I think that was, sort of what the TOC thought.
Okay. I have no objections. I just need to make sure that our RMs are good with the plan. I'll follow up with them offline. So for 120 release, we have, I believe, Xiaopeng, yes, as well as RN as secondary, and we're still waiting for a tertiary. By the way, has there been any news in the steering committee regarding identifying the tertiary RN? Has there been a steering meeting?
And Red Hat said that they were interested and would look for someone, but not 100% committed yet. And then I brought up that we're going to need more for the next release as well, and people have been notified. No one's volunteered yet.
So John, who's our primary contact on the Red Hat side?
Rob.
Rob who?
Rob Cernich, I believe, is the pronunciation.
Spelled that correctly. I can follow up with Rob online. Okay, sounds good. All right, let's move on. So Keith, Envoy filter.
Hey, yeah, wanted to check in here. There's been a couple of discussions about this a few weeks ago, months ago. I know Quat's been doing some work here, but I wanted to kind of get the community's POV and maybe get some context here. Do we ever expect Envoy filter to move out of alpha? I know that it's kind of positioned as an escape hatch type of resource, but do we foresee it getting to a point where we feel comfortable kind of solidifying the API in having beta or even stable levels of support? I'll pause for an answer to that question before moving on.
I would say in a certain form, but not with a patch functionality.
So what I'm hearing from that is not as the API is currently constructed. Is that safe to say?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Patch is too dangerous.
Got it. Okay, so that to me says that there are two different directions that we can go down. Either we improve the API or change the API and make breaking changes, and I think, or either breaking changes through actual concrete API changes / removals, or some validation restricting the use, like some sort of -- insecure or insecure skip verify, something like that. So users are constantly opting into unsafe behavior. Or we seek to try to extract the functionality of Envoy Filter into other things, other resources that have a smaller API surface that can be independently progressed through the maturity cycle. And I've got this issue here in the meeting notes issue that Quat opened a couple of months ago. It's about taking pieces of Envoy Filter functionality and turning them into Gateway API policy resources. This makes a lot of sense for gateways. Obviously, you add a target ref, and you bind to the gateway or something like that, or even maybe to the route, and woohoo, everything works. Where this gets less clear is for Envoy Filter functionality that tends to bind to workloads themselves. And Gateway API doesn't seem to have any sort of cognition of a workload, because up until and even now past the mesh support, it hasn't really needed to. I think that the approach that we're using for Istio resources, kind of in the ambient space with target ref, would be helpful here. Maybe doing workload selector and target ref as a one-off type of situation. But I think that would be an interesting direction to go. Costin, you got your hand up, and yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, 2 points. One is we may go too extreme with the target ref. Yes, I understand gateway define target ref, but that's not the end of the world or the only way to do things. And in Istio APIs, you have selector, and we are not planning to deprecate it, and it still works. So there is no law saying that everything must now stop using workload selectors and start using target ref. Network policy will not do, and a lot of other things will not do that. Service itself as a workload selector. So let's be pragmatic. Workload selector is not the problem in Envoy Filter. The problem is the patching of XDS. Now, there is a third option that I didn't mention, which is to stop not invented here, define a new API for Istio, and try to look at other vendors who have Envoy Filter APIs and see if we can adopt one, maybe. Who knows?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily opposed to that either. John asked in the chat, what are we trying to solve? And here's the essential problem statement for this line of inquiry: is that users need to accomplish certain tasks. Compression, Lua filters for header replacement using things in the connection settings, rate limiting, etc. All of these things have no formal Istio API, nor should, and in my opinion, nor should they have a full Istio API in the sense that we abstract Envoy functionality. And users that want to do these tasks using a resource API, etc., that has some guarantee around stability, safety, performance. That's above what we have in the alpha stage. So I'm looking to see if there is a way forward for some of these relatively, I would think, somewhat common tasks, especially rate limiting, without moving on my filter to beta. And for context and for what it's worth, I also don't think that we should move on my filter to beta. I think it's way too dangerous and complex, as has been mentioned. But I also see that there's no rate limiting API in Istio yet. There is no Lua or compression API. And so I'm looking to see if the community as a whole be supportive in starting some of that work, and to see if we can't get that work progressing through the maturity cycle like a normal resource. I see some conversation in the chat. Is anybody available to come off mute and kind of talk secretively on some of these?
Yeah. Yeah, I just feel like we should not be trying to make ways for users to be exposed to Envoy easier. That's the wrong direction, in my opinion. Envoy sucks for humans. Like, great infrastructure, but no one outside this room should be suffering with understanding Envoy, right? That's our job, is to suffer for our users. And I think the extent that we already expose it is probably too far. If we just become, we could be a generic Kubernetes interface for Envoy, and you program Envoy yourself, you have full control over everything. There's projects like that. They don't have any users because it's kind of terrible user experience, right? So I'm a bit worried about going down that path.
Kuvat, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that. Can you hear me? Yeah. So this is a question about what Istio API should look like in the future, right? And if you're talking about something like gateway, the gateway doesn't assume any particular data plane implementation. So you would have to, any new API should probably follow that direction. So any future for Envoy filter is sort of ruled out by that principle, because Envoy filter is by definition not data plane agnostic. So it cannot be a gateway-based API. So it will always be not better or stable or fixed. But it doesn't mean that users don't need it. I mean, I'm hearing a lot of cases when people actually want access to Envoy and they feel limited by gateway in Istio API. So I don't think we can stop Envoy filter anytime soon, but I don't think it should be promoted. So the current state is probably the state it's going to be forever. And we can improve it, but it's not something we can change in principle.
So, John, I hear what you're saying about particularly encapsulating the complexity, and how when we do APIs right, what we're doing is encapsulating Envoy's complexity to a simpler API that works for a broad number of use cases, something like the 95%. And those who need something more nuanced can break glass with Envoy filter and do all sorts of stuff. I want to play a little bit of devil's advocate and channel my inner Matt Klein. Early on in the Istio project, of course, Matt was involved, and his caution and since then his complaint has been that when we seek to try to abstract away Envoy's complexities, we end up with a very inflexible API that it does not meet 95% of use cases. It meets perhaps 60%. And then we add nuance to that API over time to make it more and more flexible. And by the time we're done with it, we've effectively just created a different version of the Envoy API. There's differences like spelling and capitalization, particular phrasing of fields, but we almost have a field-for-field reproduction of the Envoy API in some cases. So I guess my caution would be, if we can provide a meaningful abstraction, one that is generally useful and substantially less complex, I'm all for it. I'm just not super confident we can do that yet.
Yeah, I think it's a valid concern. I mean, I don't think we'll ever be as far as Envoy. Well, I mean, it should be our job to make the simple cases easy and the difficult cases possible, right? Which is to some extent what Envoy filter does today. Now, does it do the best job of that? Obviously not. I think there's a fundamental issue when you have people's unlimited demands for functionality with a declarative API, right? It's why things like eBPF and WASM exist. So I think to unlock like those next type of things. Now, I don't know that WASM is necessarily the solution, but a programmable interface is what you need for unlocking that long tail of users. Like you could imagine Istio could be a library, and you build your own, and you want custom cluster config, sure, go write some C++ code or whatever.
So maybe the solution is to take a swing at one, find one Envoy filter that is commonly needed that we think can have a really useful abstraction over the top of it, and see how that works out.
Let Costin go ahead, and then I've got to respond to that.
Yeah, I think we still have a bit extreme positions here. I mean, yeah, Envoy filter is bad because patching a lot of things. Doesn't mean we should promote it to beta. Doesn't mean we should not try to have a simpler API or adopt a simpler API that explores some filters. Now, Istio is not an Envoy. I mean, we use Envoy, but the mesh API is not supposed to be Envoy API. Gamma Gateway are trying to work with other vendors and to find common APIs that users can use with multiple implementations, so they're not stuck with Envoy or Istio if they choose to do something else. I don't think we need to, to either go to the extreme to say Istio is Envoy with some different name, nor to the extreme of saying that current Istio Envoy filter is what it is and we'll keep it forever and we'll not try to improve it. There is a middle ground here, where we try to adopt Gamma APIs or Gateway APIs that are not Envoy specific, where it makes sense to not have all the fields in Envoy because other implementations may be different, and at the same time have a safer escape hatch, which is required. We all agree that it's required in some cases.
I echo a lot of that. I think the problem that I'm seeing from my users is they want the functionality that Envoy filter provides, or rather, let me take that back. They want the functionality that at this point only Envoy filter provides, but they want it in a way where the project is going to say, hey, this thing is actually well tested. This is going to be supported under the regular support policies for beta stable features. You've done some performance testing, et cetera, et cetera. They want the ability to feel like that they're not completely on their own if they want to do rate limiting, et cetera. I put in the chat that I'm sympathetic to John's point about the limits of a declarative API. I think something like Lua gets us pretty. It would be an interesting direction to go because it gives us that programmable functionality without some of the adoption. Distribution is not too bad in WASM these days, but some of the adoption and performance concerns of WASM and Envoy specifically. And so I wouldn't be, I'd be up for doing a spike on like a Lua filter resource. And I can tell you from a gateway perspective, we've talked about, and John, in Costin, you've been in some of these meetings. We've talked in the past about the fact that there will likely be some data plane specific policies. Policy attachments in the spec is open enough, purposely open enough to where it's to allow that sort of thing. So where Envoy implementation can use certain resources and certain policies, and then maybe just Nginx implementations that will build on this collection of policies. And so the thing that people are hesitating on is that people aren't going out and doing it except for Envoy Gateway at this point. And so I think there's appetite for folks to use, for folks like Istio to go and do the work and say, here's what we've done. It works for us for these reasons. It doesn't work for these reasons. And then come to the community to say, here's a direction we could go. Envoy Lua doesn't necessarily have to work for Nginx. With policies, that's what I'm trying to say is that we could, we could create an Envoy specific policy attachments, and that would not go against the Gamma or Gateway spec. Technically, Gamma is not its own spec, but yeah, it wouldn't go against the Gateway spec to have data plane specific policies. And so that's kind of the direction I'm trying to go to see. Okay, say for Envoy filter, yes, but if there's no future. Or if the future of Envoy filter getting to that beta stable maturity is in the order of years versus months, I'm trying to see if there's something in the order of months that we could attempt to try to get this functionality in the hands of users, and maybe hopefully get a better pattern for this. Well,
Yeah, just what I'm worried about is that if you define a new API that is something like Envoy filter, but gateway based and it's still very Envoy specific, it's only incrementally better than Envoy filter. It's not a gateway API, so it doesn't give you any new portability guarantees if you can run it in Nginx or whatever. Just different syntax essentially, right? With better testing and some incremental API improvements. That's kind of hard to sell, because if we tried that before, when we tried to do WASM stuff, unless there is an actual improvement, it's too expensive to create new APIs. If there's no actual improvement over Envoy filter, it's better to spend effort on improving Envoy filter rather than try to create a new API with brand new issues that is only marginally better than Envoy filter. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I appreciate those thoughts. I guess my question is, how do you define better than Envoy filter? Because the thing with Envoy filter is that Envoy filter only gets to beta if all of Envoy filter gets to beta. That's kind of the big blocker that I see, is that in order for stability to get to a point, or the stability of the testing, et cetera, to move forward, everything about Envoy filter has to move forward. And so that's inherently limiting when you talk about maturity and iteration in a community sense. And I'm wondering if there isn't a way to distribute that improvement.
I don't know where you got this idea that all the filters need to be better or whatever. I mean, the problem is, again, the patching of XDS. I mean, in my opinion, at least, we compile a number of filters. If we only compile the stable filters, and we have stability guarantees, and we problem to guarantee the stability of their API. Our problem is that we are stuck with XDS. We cannot change, and it's too difficult to patch. I wouldn't put them in the same bucket. I mean, one is an Envoy problem, the other one is our structural problem.
I'm not 100% sure I understand this. So you're saying that the problem with Envoy filter is the patch semantics, patching XDS specifically in general?
Yes, that's at least my take in this. I mean, it's not necessarily that rate limiting filter is not stable, or that Envoy filter must support all the filters in Envoy, because we don't compile them in. We only compile, or we're only supposed to compile the filters that are reaching a particular level of maturity, and those are stable as our APIs technically. The problem is how we are actually, defining what happens. I mean, using XDS names, using patch semantics, which are very unstable.
So that was the reason for my initial question is, will Envoy filter ever get out of alpha? Because if the problem is structural with the resource and its semantics, then and how it does patching, and from my light usage of Envoy filter, it seems like a lot of the reason for patching is because it is such a generic wide API. Wouldn't an alternative approach be, hey, let's make the scope tighter. These new APIs apply to less scenarios, and then maybe we don't have the patching semantics issue. We can have independent testing on it, and that thing can move through our maturity process much more rapidly and with much more safety than if we would try to do it with Envoy filter, just because of the generic scope that's there on purpose in Envoy filter.
What are your thoughts about the service extensions API that Shiram put out a while ago? I mean, it would fit Lua if we allowed Lua as an extension.
Yeah, I don't have any problems with that approach. I do think that Envoy taking handling that use case, that extension use case better natively is a good move in the right direction. And I'd be happy to see that. Again, just to give some context from where I'm coming from, I'm thinking specifically on gauging the community's appetite for doing things on a quicker timeline. even with that service extensions API, and again, I've looked at it a couple of times, not in a ton of detail, need to give it a proper once over. But it feels like the kind of thing that would be in the order of several months, in the longer end of months, maybe even a year, or a year plus. And so, you know, especially if we don't have consensus now on, I'm trying to gauge the community's appetite for something in the next release or two to spike out an alternative approach to things that currently only exist in Envoy filters. To go back to something John said in the chat, I agree. We should just make APIs, first class APIs for gaps that we have. But I guess I'm trying to figure out the right way to make those APIs. If we had are we opposed to a Lua filter in totality? Yes, no, maybe. Are we opposed to rate limit API specifically? I think that's probably the thing that we have the most consensus on. It's a thing that customers, even in public channels, I see our users in the public channel have asked for multiple years. But I'm just kind of going down the line and seeing, okay, what is possible to do in what timeline.
If you're talking about just 2 months, I don't think we can create a new API in 2 months and make it, ship it. It comes pretty fast. We can start proposing it, but I think it's effort to spend on improving Envoy filter for whatever subset you want, and you can define the subset and sort of logically or analyze it and validate it. Make sure it's something that's, so that users don't write things that we don't support.
To get things moving, can we next week have a survey? I mean, a list of all the Envoy-based vendors and their Envoy filter API. Maybe we can just pick one. And I really believe defining another API for Istio, it's probably not ideal compared with just stealing one of the, reusing one of the other vendors API if it makes sense. I mean, it's at least a starting point, or will not be the only ones. Either of them, because I completely agree. I mean, there's no point for us to inventing another API for especially for sidecars.
Austin, I don't think we can directly adopt another vendor's APIs, because then if they choose to change their APIs, we're sort of stuck with their decisions henceforth. But it's possible that we could find some that we have a lot of common ground with, and can come up with some sort of a shared standard, possibly even as part of the Gamma initiative.
I don't mean using their exact API, just make a copy of their proto and their CRP, change the resource, and at least users will write exactly the same YAML for a while, and it will incentivize them to keep it stable as well.
I see.
In the time that you were chatting, I did a couple of some quick Googling to see like an ambassador, ingress, and their filter API. I mean, it's strongly typed, thankfully. I mean, so it's got like a top level JWT thing, but it feels like they crammed all the things into one giant resource, which isn't the worst thing in the world. But I guess
let's look at multiple, not only one. I mean, it's again, there are several that are doing this, and we can find the middle ground. We can find an average or something.
Well, I mean, my concern is that we turn to the XKCD comment, right? If there are 13, let's say there are 5 different Envoy vendors who have an Envoy filter API, 6 if you include Istio. We picked that API and shifted a bit. Now we've just created a 7th API, right?
But that was original proposal, that creates a 7th without even looking at the other 6. So at least we look at the other 6, which is a step forward.
Right, but if we try to, my concern is, like Mitch said, if we attach ourselves, like it sounds good to go and try to align with other vendors, and I do think that's the direction we should go overall. but I think, in my opinion, the throw all the different things that Envoy can do inside one resource approach has inherent flaws and inherent complexity because it's doing way too many things. And I don't know that we solve that by just picking another API that's doing way too many things.
Well, let's do the research first. I mean, that's not my favorite either, but let's do research. Let's at least evaluate and see what's the pros and cons for each of them. So at least we don't jump into another API with, eyes closed.
Yeah, I can certainly do the research and bring back some options. I'll make a notes. Typing out here on other Envoy filter APIs. I guess what the overall feedback that I'm hearing from the community though is that there seems to be little interest or appetite in breaking up Envoy filter, and that the community would rather that effort be spent on improving Envoy filter wholesale. Is that accurate? Yes, no, maybe.
I don't know, what does breaking it up mean? Making a Lua API?
Yeah, Lua, rate limit, similar to your point, the direction you've kind of gone with Wasm filter, and having these be independent pieces of functionality within the Istio API rather than all shoved into Envoy filter.
I'm fine with making first-class Istio APIs. It's a very, very high bar. I'm not fine with saying every Envoy thing becomes an Istio API that we just slap into a CRD. And those are quite different. And I'm not necessarily like saying I'm fine with every filter becoming a first-class thing either. Like something like rate limiting, that's a major feature. We've tried to make an API in the past. There's a lot of complexity that I'm not necessarily aware of, but I know there's a lot. But it's the type of thing that could be an API. But I don't think we should make 40 CRDs for every filter or just slap Envoy rate limiting into a CRD.
That's fair. Yeah, and I probably didn't represent myself well in not defining this. I'm hoping to improve the overall. Obviously there. I would be making a design doc and such, but I'm hoping to improve the overall experience around the feature itself in doing this. And I also agree that we shouldn't go around and just make every single Envoy thing a filter. I think based on Quat's doc about things that still have need for Envoy filter are rate limiting, compression, and Lua. And I think those feel like good places to start. Would you say, do we have any kind of initial thoughts on those three? I think rate limiting kind of have existing consensus that we need to improve there. How do you feel about compression in Lua?
So I think that we are mixing four things together here. I mean, rate limiting, there is pretty clear consensus. The only question is if it should be an Istio API or a gateway API, because I suspect it's much better a gateway API where other vendors besides Envoy can participate. So we don't create an Envoy specific API in Istio, but it's more generic APIs that can be implemented multiple rate limiting and multiple technology load balancers and so forth, because it's something that should be done, L1 load balancers, and it's a very important API, not something we should be, tie ourselves to only Envoy design. And Lua, it's the other extreme where I don't know. I don't see a need for Istio to have ever Lua API. But that doesn't mean we should not have an API that allows people to use their own whatever filters they want that is better than current mess that we have with Envoy filter. I mean, we should have a safer Envoy filter APIs that may allow Lua, and we should adopt rate limiting if it's ever defined by gateway API. And for other things, we may define, I mean, case by case. It's based on the need of the users and as it always was with Istio. So compression, for example, yeah, I see no problem. It's a pretty clear use case. Adding it to one of the existing APIs as a field, it shouldn't be a huge effort.
John, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing we should also consider is there's a lot of prior art for building external CRDs that compile down to Envoy filters. That's a way to expose a more stable or ergonomic interface without actually changes to Istio. There's some third-party projects doing this for rate limiting and other L7 protocols like MySQL, Redis, Kafka, etc.
I like that.
Does that? I'm not opposed to that. That's an interesting idea. Does that? I guess my question would be, could that resource, could that external CRD ever be on a higher maturity or stability than the underlying Envoy filter itself?
Well, I think if we did that, we would probably not. It would probably not be a core one, right? It's like an external controllers. I mean, kind of in the past, we did telemetry, I think, compiled down to Envoy filters in the past. Maybe not.
Yeah, we did.
We did it, yeah. And it's just a worse implementation, really, from performance perspective. So if it was first class, we probably wouldn't do it that way, although it is can be a quick way to implement it. But it does, like I said, allow third-party APIs.
And Kit, there is a difference between Envoy filter as a internal extension point where we control the patching, and we when we modify the structure of the XDS, we can modify how we generate the Envoy filter, versus exposing to a user, hey, you can patch the XDS of Istio D. Good luck if the structure of the XDS changes. So having the API be something clean that is not exposing patch semantics externally is even better, because it's not our responsibility. It's Envoy defines the API. Some other dude created the CRD. We just provide a mechanism to make sure that it's always properly put in the right place. And initially, it could be a controller that generates Envoy filter, but then it can be implemented directly. I mean, we can support external APIs just like we support gateways, translating them to virtual services. We have a lot of flexibility in how we implement it and how we keep the implementation at a stable level. It's an API semantics exposed to the user that we are not comfortable with, and it's alpha.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that anything that we do, we'll certainly want to do due diligence to see if we can't kind of collapse on a single or at least one spec, and find some consensus in the community. So yeah, no opposition from me. Okay, so in that case, rate. I know we've got a lot of consensus on rate limiting, but as has been brought up before, this would be the third or fourth go round for a rate limiting filter, and I'm hoping to maybe find something simpler to prove out the concept and have discussions on the approach, less so than the implementation specifics. And especially with, WASM plugin appears to be in a sort of similar boat to Envoy filter, where it's not really, doesn't seem to be progressing, and there might be some core technological concerns with the WASM implementation in Envoy. And so in the light of that, if folks would be on board with reviewing a doc for it, I'd be inclined to start looking into a Lua filter for to provide some imperative escape patch, and taking the feedback that we want to avoid patch semantics, not be dependent on the particulars of the COD XDS naming and ordering and such. And I can write up a doc for that, and then see what we think about as a first class API specifically, and then see what the community thinks about that. Does that sound good to everybody? I'm not hearing opposition, and I see a thumbs up and a head nod from Mitch. So I will take that as enough. I'll take that as good enough. Okay, I appreciate the time, folks.
All right, thank you for the discussion so far. That's the end of the list of agenda here. Does anyone else have anything to discuss? All right, well, going once, going twice, going three times, and if there's nothing else, then let's call it a day. Thank you. See you later.